Welcome to Leveling Up Your Pricing Strategy, aka PriceLabs 201. My name is Layla, and I will be your host today. I do want to get you started off on the right foot, so I do want to make sure everyone's aware that this is a level 2 webinar. If you haven't done your initial setup, we do have a PriceLabs 101 course that I highly recommend, and I also host. So be sure to check that out first prior to watching this 201. Additionally, I want to go over kind of the layout of how this webinar will go. First is going to be a 30-minute pre-recorded guide with me on going through the content and the tips on getting your account a little bit more thoroughly set up. Additionally, after that, you will have a 20-minute Q&A with a product specialist of ours. That's going to be live, and that's going to be to get any of your questions answered. Throughout my portion, the pre-recorded section, you do have the option to send in questions. There should be a Q&A box or a question box where you can go ahead and enter any questions, even while you are watching the pre-recorded section. Then, when a product specialist hops on at the very end of the call, they can have a list of the questions that you've had throughout the entire recording and can get those addressed for you. My goal with this webinar is to get you a little bit more comfortable in analyzing your listings, their metrics, and how to identify points of improvements or maybe places where you can kind of learn or grow a little bit more, and how to address those issues that may arise accordingly. To do this, the first place I'd like to start is the pricing dashboard. So the pricing dashboard is kind of the homepage for most of you. There's a lot of really good information here that I think is typically a little bit underutilized. So while you do have your listings located here, you also have a bunch of really good data over here on the side. You can adjust this to show any data that you're interested in that we have. One of the first things I would recommend is looking at the Add a Column button. So what this does is it lets you remove things that are maybe unnecessary and cleans up your view a little bit. For example, in my account, I don't use tags too often, so I'm going to go ahead and remove that here. And then what I can do is kind of focus more on the things that are important to me. I would really like to know cities because I do like to group by those on occasion. Bedroom counts are going to be the same thing. I may have those memorized, but it's nice to be able to sort and group those together at a glance. So I will keep this the way it is then. Next is going to be the add a metric button. What this does is it lets you select what information you'd like to see on this main page. The default inside of PriceLabs is going to be typically the couple of occupancy totals for the next X, Y, and Z number of days, right? So if you would like to change those, if maybe those don't mean a whole lot to you, this is where you would go. Additionally, you can click here to add different metrics. So on top of the 3 defaults, you could add more if you'd like. To keep our view a little bit cleaner during this example, I'm going to go ahead and just change mine instead of adding. So the first thing I'm going to change is going to be the total occupancy 7 days. When you click here, you have a huge variety of different metrics that you can add. This may be a little bit overwhelming, but what I highly, highly recommend is going to be hovering over these eyes next to each title. What that does is it shows you exactly what this metric is looking at. For example, total occupancy is a little bit different than adjusted occupancy due to blocks. And if you hover over the little information icon, it shows you that. This is super duper useful once you get into kind of the more tricky suggestions. Nights booked, for example, is the total number of nights booked in the last X days versus booking pickup, which is the total number of unique bookings in the last X days, right? So there's, again, a ton of really, really good information here. Please prioritize whatever makes sense to you to prioritize, whether that be, occupancy statistics, revenue statistics, whatever is most helpful to you and whatever is going to be helpful to see at a glance pretty consistently. A couple of the ones that we suggest at PriceLabs include total occupancy, Of course, this is going to be your listing's occupancy, but it also will compare that to the local market's occupancy as well. So for this example, I'm going to say the next 30 days occupancy. No, I've got next 30 days already. Let's do next 60 days occupancy, super important to me. Another very, very useful one is going to be the market penetration index. This is one of those you may have to hover over. So the market penetration index takes your listing's occupancy and divides it by the market occupancy, which essentially then gives you a good idea of where you stand compared to the market. To make things a little bit easier on us, I'm going to choose next 60-day for that as well, so that it shows side by side. And then finally, I'm going to hit the minimum price hitting days. So what this does is it shows you what percentage of your dates for the next X days are hitting your minimum price. What that tells you is, hey, I either need to maybe lower my minimum price so that I'm not hitting it all the time, or I need to raise my base price since it is a little maybe too close to my min price. You can dive into that a little bit deeper, and we will, on which option is better to do. But for the sake of the example, I'm going to go ahead and say min price hitting in the next 60 days. When I update my changes, you'll see this chart update here. Perfect. So, as a little bit of um, some more details, I guess, into how to use this, what you can do is once you have metrics selected, you can sort by those metrics, which is super nice because if something like total occupancy next 60 days is really important to you, it lets you sort those by most occupied to least occupied or the opposite, which then at a glance lets you see which units are performing super well and could maybe use higher prices. Or it shows you which units are not performing super well and could maybe use either different pricing strategies or there's something to look in on that, and do some deep diving into figuring out what's going on. The market penetration index, we discussed a little bit ago, is going to be your occupancy divided by the market's occupancy. The best way to look at this, I think, is whatever MPI number you have here, that's how your listing's occupancy is comparing to the market's. So for example, I've got a flat 2.0 here. That means that my listing's occupancy for the next 60 days is going to be almost exactly double the market's occupancy. When we hover over the total occupancy next 60 days to the left there, as you can see, the pop-up confirms. So it's got the listings total occupancy at 43, whereas the market's total occupancy is 21%. So in this situation, this is a 2.2, so this is going to be a little bit over double the market's occupancy. And again, confirmed through those numbers as well. So these are some pretty key indicators. Minimum price hits is out of the next 60 days, what percent of those days is hitting your minimum price. When these are higher, you're typically going to get the base price nudges like you see here, or the minimum price nudges, excuse me, where it tells you to maybe differentiate your minimum price and your base price a little bit more so that there's some actual fluctuation and some dynamicness to your listing, right? Um, so that kind of takes us through the pricing dashboard. One last thing I want to show you is the listing filter. So what this does is it lets you filter your listings by certain metrics. So let's say you wanted to look at all of your listings which had less than 20% occupancy in the last 30 days, but also are maybe looking at, let's look at booking pickup past 15 days too. And have had less than 5 bookings in the past 15 days. Once you hit show listings here, it's going to show you all of the listings that you have in your portfolio that fall into these categories that you've selected here. So it would have to be listings that are performing poorly in the past 30 days or are performing less than 20% occupancy in the past 30 days, and the booking pickup for the past 15 days is less than 5. So once I hit show listings, it would show me all of the listings that I have that fall into that. I won't do that on mine. It's a demo account, so it's going to pull up every one of them because I've never had a booking on it. But if you have certain metrics that you really like and certain filters that you really like, what you can do is save those filters for quick reference. And then instead of having to go through and set those rules each time you want to filter listings, you can save use a saved filter here under quick filters. And then you can also choose to do things like grouping via tags, via city, all of that good stuff to kind of fine tune your results. So if you have a certain revenue that you're expected to meet in a certain city or a certain revenue you're expecting out of your one bedrooms, you can go ahead and combine those here and get a really good idea of where you stand. Next up, we'll be talking about the neighborhood data tabs. So this can be found by going into any one of your listings, selecting review prices, and getting to the neighborhood data tab here. There's a ton of really useful information under the neighborhood data tab. It's one of my personal favorites, and it's also kind of the spot I usually go to when I'm trying to figure out if there's something kind of wonky or incorrect or just off in general about a listing and its prices. So the first chart that we see here is the future prices graph. What this shows you is the prices that you have set inside of PriceLabs, which would fall onto this black line here that you see, and compares that to what the prices of the market are. So as you can see in the background, there's a couple of colors. There's the gray, there's the deep red, and then there's the light red. Those are going to be different percentiles of the market. So if you were to take every one of your competitors in the area and put them on a graph from least expensive to most expensive, that is how we determine percentiles. So on that chart, the least expensive being here at the bottom, the most expensive being here at the top, the 25th percentile is going to fall kind of near the bottom. It means that listings in this area are typically about as expensive as they're typically more expensive than about 25% of the market, but are less expensive than the other 75%. The same goes for 50%, the 50th percentile. If you are in the 50th percentile, that is kind of smack dab in the middle. You are about as, excuse me, your price is right in the middle of the entire bunch. 50% of folks are higher price than you, about 50% are lower price than you. You're right there in the middle. And then you also have the 75th percentile. That's going to be being more expensive than about 75% of properties, whereas you're less expensive than about 25%. So it's an entire range for your market. The colors in the back that you see here are defined by percentiles. So the gray color that you see, the very bottom of it is the 25th percentile, and the very top of it is the 50th percentile. So if you are in that range, you are kind of like mid to mostly low in terms of price for your market, where the where the red section and the gray section meet, that's going to be exactly the 50th percentile. If you're unsure of how to price your unit and you're kind of wanting to lean more towards being right in the middle of the pack, that's where I shoot for. That's what makes sense, especially for newer properties or properties where you don't have a great idea of the pricing structure just yet. That's a solid place to aim for. And then the red section is going to be the 50th percentile to the 75th percentile. So kind of right there in the middle to a little bit slightly above the middle in terms of pricing. The very top of the red section, where it meets the pinkish section, is going to be the 75th percentile. So that's kind of where you start to consider like upscale luxury units, things that have a lot of amenities, brand new builds, yada yada. There's lots of things that could encourage people to price in that section. The super light red or pink section is going to be the tippity top of the market. So it's going to be 75th percentile to the 90th percentile. We stop at the 90th percentile to kind of remove any of those outliers that may be pricing super duper high, but not actually renting or whatnot. It just cuts down the wonky data in that, right? So what you're seeing here is the black line falling into kind of the 75th percentile pretty consistently. My pricing is right at the top of the red and the bottom of the pink. So it is pretty consistently at that 75% range, right? What that means is I may be priced a little bit high compared to like mid-market kind of stuff, or the middle of the market, excuse me, kind of stuff, but it's not absurdly high in most instances. I'm kind of okay with that because it's a 3 bedroom, but it's a large 3 bedroom and it's really luxurious. So that's fine with me. If you guys would like, you can again aim kind of for the middle where the gray and the red meet. That would be the 50th percentile, and that is not necessarily a sweet spot in every instance, but it's a good point of reference for sure. In addition to that, we've got a couple of really cool tools here. So one of them is going to be the AI Insights button. When you click that, you get this little pop-up that gives you some really good analysis and some good details about your market and the prices. So it'll show you what pricing is high season pricing, what pricing is low season pricing, and then it shows you how your prices are compared to the market in those seasons. Additionally, it'll show you cool things like surges in pricing and kind of highlight the key takeaways from this graph for you if you are not a graph person. There's some really cool things that you can deduce from these charts. So if your pricing is super duper high, pretty consistently throughout the year, what that's going to tell you is that your base price may be a little bit too high. Of course, if you are top of the market, that's something to keep in mind here as well. You have to kind of figure out where you'd like to fall and then see if your pricing matches up to that. If this unit, for example, is kind of more on the economic side and maybe not, brand new, it doesn't have a lot of amenities, I may shoot for kind of the lower end of the spectrum here, right? And looking at this chart, I would say, oh my goodness, I am above where I'd like to be. Let me go ahead and adjust my base price, and that will adjust your price for the entirety of the year and the entirety of this graph, essentially. Another option is seeing that there are too many fluctuations or too big of fluctuations. As you can see here, there's an event going on next year that is skyrocketing my prices. While I'm pretty consistently kind of in the 75th percentile, here for some of these events, I get super expensive. And that's not exactly how I'd like to be. If you're seeing the fluctuations get too big, what you can adjust is going to be the sensitivity of your demand factor. That'll be under customizations and it will be under smart presets. You've got this demand factor sensitivity setting, and that adjusts how much things like weekends, general demand, events, etc., are fluctuating your prices. So by default, you're going to stay on the PriceLabs recommended. You do have the option to go lower, so that means your swings are not as intense or dramatic. You do also have the option to select high, which would then increase those fluctuations and those swings. So in high demand periods, you are pushing prices, raising them higher and higher. And for low demand days, you're okay dropping prices. Those are the two differences between here. I'm going to go ahead and keep mine at recommended, um, just so I don't mess with my own chart here. And then another option that it can show you is if you are seeing really good pricing and you are kind of exactly where you want to be in terms of the market, that tells you that maybe there's something else going on. Whether that be, improvements to the Airbnb account directly, improvements to photos, reviews, etc. A lot of the time, if pricing is really good, it means we have to look at something else maybe. One of the things inside of PriceLabs that you can check is going to be things like your minimum stay regulations and rules. So If you are interested in seeing what the market is doing, I highly recommend that. So if you scroll down just a smidgen here, you've got your market history section. What this tells you is some really good info on market length of stay. So, in my area, for example, the average length of stay that people are booking is around 3 nights. It fluctuates throughout the year and drops down to like 2 nights on some months. It increases up to 4 months, or excuse me, 4 nights in January in some months. So what this tells me is I probably shouldn't make my minimum stay requirements be too high because then I may lose out on quite a few bookings. So if I were to make my minimum stay be 4 nights, for example, there's a lot of my possible clients that I'd be missing out on because they're not typically looking for that sort of stay, right? What this lets you do is realize in data form what's going on around you and helps you figure out how you can adjust your settings to um, kind of take all of that into account. So if you were to, let's say, be priced perfectly or be priced really low even, um, but you're still not getting bookings, this is a really good place to start and kind of check in on the market and see what they're doing. Minimum stays are going to be really impactful, honestly. People aren't always willing to increase or decrease their length of stay. Sometimes they're looking very specifically, and you don't really want to box out a good portion of your clientele, especially if your statistics are similar to mine, right? Where they're pretty consistent. The next thing that I want to talk about is going to be this occupancy chart. So this is super duper useful. I really like adding this last year's data here just to make it a little bit more useful to myself. What this shows you is a couple of things. I'm going to clean this up a little bit while explaining it so that we can understand what's going on. So the red line is going to be your current market's occupancy. So as of today, what the occupancy looks like in your market for the future. How many bookings have been made for each specific day out of all of the listings available, etc. What the gray line, the gray solid line shows you is what the market occupancy was like last year today. So on last year's exact, if you looked at last year's bookings on exactly this date, the gray is how the market occupancy would have been then. Finally, you have this market occupancy last year final, which is going to be this dotted line. What that shows you is the final occupancy for those days. So for example, if I go to January 1st, 2025, my market occupancy last year today was 3.3. So 3% of my market was booked up when I looked at this day last year. Whereas by the time January 1st actually rolled around, the occupancy of the market ended up being 38%. So there was a ton of room to grow. There was, what is that, 35% more occupancy by January 1st when you're comparing it to this same time last year. So what that tells you is you actually have room to grow by January 1st. While your occupancy may not look super high, there's definitely room to grow and there's room for the market to grow. There's a demand that's probably going to be coming up versus a demand that you may have missed out on, excuse me. Additionally, you can change this to show you your monthly occupancy. This is super cool because it shows you the same sort of data just on a monthly grouping, and then it'll show you your listings projected occupancy as well based on what you have booked already. So tons of really, really good data. It'll show you the market occupancy last year today, which we have talked about, and then the market occupancy once we got to that month or to that day. So tons and tons of good data here. We also have the AI Insights tool on this section. So I'm going to go ahead and select it. What this will show you is, hey, weekend demand is a little bit higher for me on days, or excuse me, throughout the year. So it's a weekend travel market. That means I should probably price accordingly and make sure I have my weekends in check. Current market performance market seasonality, surges in demand, all of that stuff is shown here. And then it shows you how your booking pickup is performing compared to last year. So a ton of really good data. And again, it just really summarizes what's in this chart if you're not a charts person like me. So tons and tons of good info here. And then finally, I'll go down to our competitor calendar. So this is super duper useful in a number of ways. What this allows you to do is it allows you to select a couple of competitors around you to compare your calendar to theirs. For example, I know this unit off the top of my head. I know that this is a direct competitor of mine. So I'm going to go ahead and see what they're doing. I'm going to go ahead and see a couple of other units that are other 3 bedrooms around me as well. And then I'm going to hit update data. And you'll see here, you get a really cool little calendar that shows all of those comps that you've selected. It'll show you some good info from Airbnb about them. So what their cleaning fees are, what their service fees are like, etc. In addition, it gives you a calendar where it shows you their pricing day to day. It shows you their minimum stays next to the little crescent moon. And then it also shows you if they're booked or not. So if they're crossed out like this, they'll be booked. If they are blocked nights, they'll be showing up as NA, like you see here. So what this allows you to do is say, hey, these are some really similar units to mine. These are comps that I'm very well aware of. Instead of going through Airbnb and creeping on their calendars individually and all of that stuff, it lets you do it at a glance. This is useful for figuring out if maybe units that are priced higher than yours are still, performing super well. For example, this fire pit unit here is priced well above what my unit's priced at, but it's booked pretty consistently, especially on weekends. What that tells me is I maybe have room to grow or room to push my pricing up a little bit. Additionally, you can go in and click on each of the competitors where it'll take you to their properties and their Airbnb listings, which is very useful. And it lets you kind of see what they're doing and lets you keep an eye on them. Finally, we are going to talk about portfolio analytics, and specifically the KPI section in portfolio analytics. To get to this page, you'll want to click the portfolio analytics banner at the top and then hit KPIs and historic reports, which will take you to this page. This is a lot of information and can oftentimes be overwhelming, so I'm going to go through and explain every little bit just to make sure that everyone is on the same track and everyone understands what we're seeing here. So as you can see, there's a ton of different KPIs or key performance indicators shown here. The first one is going to be revenue. Of course, that's going to be the revenue for whatever listings that we're looking at. I'll go into kind of defining which listings we look at and grouping and filtering and all of that stuff here in a minute, but I want to make sure everyone gets a good idea of these KPIs. So next up is going to be average length of stay. The average length of stay is how long people are typically booking with you. All of the data that you see here is based on your listings. So whether that be your entire portfolio or a filtered down set of listings, this is all your data instead of market data. Then we've got the number of bookings. That's going to be the total number of unique bookings. We've got average booking window. That's how far in advance people are booking with you. So for example, if people tend to book about a month out, your average booking window would be about a month, right? Next, we've got occupancy. That is, as it sounds, it's just your occupancy percentage. I'm going to skip over RevPAR for just a sec. ADR is going to be your average daily rate. That's your average price per night, essentially. Going back to RevPAR, this is a really useful tool, but it's a little bit tough for me to explain sometimes. So it stands for revenue per available room. To make it a little bit simpler, it's just going to be your average daily rate times your occupancy. That way, instead of, giving you a number that shows you what your pricing is, not necessarily taking into account how occupied you were, it mixes those two together, right? It takes into account both your pricing per night and how many of those nights were booked. So my RevPAR in this instance is going to be 67. And then finally, number of active listings here. That's how many listings you have actively managed. So it'll show you how many listings we're pulling data for from your PMS or your OTA. And then now that we've got that down, let me show you a couple of quick things. So as you can see, there's two sets of numbers here. The top number is going to be for in this instance, the current revenue for your units. And then that is also highlighted by this number down here, which in this case is 705K. What that number is the difference between this number and what we're comparing it with. To define what this number and what we're comparing it with mean, you'll have to come up here. So the number that you want the direct data for is always going to be this compare number here. In this instance, I've got YTD, which means year to date, and you can confirm the dates that that's going to pull info for. In my instance, it's January 1st through October 18th of this year. If you'd like, you can click on this and you can change it to this quarter. You can change it to any variety of these, or you can go ahead and do a custom date range. Then you'd click on this section and be able to select which dates you'd like to compare. I'm going to go ahead and keep this at this year. And then I am going to go over here and look at this width section. The width section is what you are being compared to. So it's going to show you this difference between this period, right? So if I'm looking at this year compared with the same period last year, it may not be super duper useful because we're still in the middle of this year. Let me go back and change that to year to date because that makes a little bit more sense in my opinion. Okay, perfect. So year to date compared to the same period last year. So you're comparing January 1st through October 18th of 2024 with January 1st to October 18th of 2023. Additionally, this is something that you can change. So instead of doing same period last year, you can do same previous period, which would be a little bit more useful in instances where you're doing like this quarter. If you selected this quarter and same previous quarter, it would compare this financial quarter with last financial quarter. And same goes for this month versus same period, same previous period would be this month versus last month. So it's hugely customizable. It can give you whatever data that's most important to you. I'm going to go back to year to date and same period last year. Perfect. And then you can also customize this to see if you are looking at when people stayed with you versus when people created their bookings with you. That's a big difference, of course. Stay dates are going to include things like revenue and ADR and all of that good stuff a little bit more precisely, I'd say, versus booking creation dates. You don't really know if those people ended up staying with you. You don't know things like that. So it's up to you how to use this. You can get a lot of really good booking data from sorting by booking creation date, but I do like the stay dates for the examples that we're going to have here. So, as I mentioned, this top number is going to be your total revenue or whichever KPI we're looking at for this first period. And then the green and red are indicators of how you're currently performing compared to this second period that you've selected here. So in this instance, my year-to-date revenue is 4.18 million. This is fake, by the way. And that is up 705,000 from last year comparatively. And then additionally, so length of stay is going to be 2.88 for the whole year. And that is actually down by just a smidgen compared to the same period last year. And so on and so forth. So this gives you a really good idea and lets you kind of compare and contrast directly instead of, having to look those numbers up individually and all of that good stuff. A couple of really good things to look at is going to be things like your average booking window. I know, of course, revenue, length of stay, that kind of stuff is really important as well, but I think average booking window is a little bit underutilized. For example, if your average booking window is super duper short, like if you're in a market where people are typically booking just 7 days in advance, that gives you a lot of really good insights, right? So what that can tell you is, hey, maybe it's just the market, and that's kind of what I have to pay attention to. Or it could mean that maybe you have to kind of re-strategize your pricing. If the market's data isn't in line with what your data is showing, it could mean that there's room to grow or room to improve. So if you have a really short booking window, typically that means you're offering maybe too many price reductions in that last minute period, right? Or it could be that you are doing too many like future pricing premiums and you're scaring people away from future bookings due to those premiums. There's a ton of, again, really, really good information here and a ton of really good stuff to take a look at. Obviously, things like revenue and occupancy are things that are pretty simple to understand what they're meaning and what they mean for your business or for your portfolio as a whole. But there's a lot of really good information in these kind of more obscure features and more obscure metrics as well, which is super awesome. But yeah, having all of this data readily available for your listing specifically is huge, and it makes reporting and keeping track of things super easy. Additionally, what you can do, as I mentioned at the beginning, is filter your listings. So let's say you want to pull this same information just for, let's see, listings that are 3 bedrooms. You can go in here and filter that way. You can also filter by 3 bedrooms in a certain city if you'd like. Um, that way you can keep an eye out in a little bit more of a specific way. Maybe having 4.18 million in revenue isn't super useful to you to see that big of a number, but seeing that data kind of spread out and focused in on a little bit more in a specific bedroom category or city is a little better or a little bit more useful to you. Today, we covered a good chunk of information and a lot about metrics and how to kind of figure out where your listings stand, how to analyze them, and some best practice strategies for fixing any issues that may arise. I hope that this was useful to you, and I want to thank you guys for hanging out and watching this. I hope that you have a good time in your Q&A and that you have tons and tons of questions. A product specialist will be on to do the Q&A with you live here momentarily. I just wanted to hop on and say thank you again. If you need anything, please don't hesitate to reach out to us here at support@pricelabs.co.